Colleagues, I address this plenary with a heavy heart and a deep sense of urgency. We came to Busan with a mission to define a global pathway to end plastic pollution. We did not achieve what we came for, a binding treaty that addresses the full life cycle of plastics, of which production is a part of.
This was Panama's statement on the last night of the plastics treaty negotiations in South Korea last year. It was the meeting of the INC, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. Their fifth, INC 5, was supposed to be the final meeting.
A legally binding obligation to phase out the most harmful plastic products and chemicals of concerns in plastics is a cornerstone for an effective treaty. It is what we must do to protect human health and the environment from plastic pollution, as promised by UNEP Resolution 514.
That night in Busan, the Mexican delegate spoke on behalf of 94 countries. Nevertheless, the meeting ended without an agreement. Media reported that the plastics treaty talks had failed. But the negotiations are far from over, and there is still hope. In this episode, I'm going to give you an update on where we stand and what's to come. My name is Anja Krieger, and this is Plastisphere, the podcast on plastics, people, and the planet. To bring you the latest, I spoke with three of the smartest observers of plastics policy: Magnus Lovold from CIEL, the Norwegian Academy of International Law, Chris Dixon from EIA, the Environmental Investigation Agency, and Andrés Del Castillo from CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law. These are all NGOs, non-governmental organizations that work on plastic pollution. First, I caught up with Magnus in early April. Great, Magnus. So the last time we met was on, I believe, December 1st, midnight in Busan, South Korea. We're sitting in the hallways of the convention center, and the final plenary is still running. But it's already clear that they won't come to an agreement this time. So, bring us up to speed. What happened since then?
Yeah, what has happened is actually quite difficult to get a sense of what has happened, because of course in Busan, when we were there, sitting there at midnight, they had this debate going on. We knew they wouldn't conclude an agreement, but we still saw a lot of positive energy, I think, in the room. We saw these statements that were made by big groups of states saying things like, we are ready to move ahead and adopt certain provisions, key provisions in this treaty. But it was also clear that the meeting would not be able to conclude the treaty. And what happened was that the chair, towards the end, he said, okay, I propose that we suspend the session and then that we resume it at a later point.
There is a general agreement to resume the current session at a later date to conclude our negotiations.
And we didn't even know at this point exactly when. So the meeting didn't close. The INC 5 is still, in a sense, formally ongoing. It's just been put on hold. They pressed the pause button, and then they're going to press play again later in 2025. And we now know the dates for the resumed session. We know it's going to be the first weeks of August in Geneva, actually, which I have to say I'm very happy about. I'm based in Geneva, and my wife is very happy about that, so I don't have to travel for 2 weeks. But so we know now that there's going to be a resume session. They're going to pick this thing up again. They're going to pick up from where they left in Busan, and then they're going to try again, basically, in Geneva in August to conclude an agreement. So although we saw the headlines coming out of Busan in the media, I think, the BBC's talked about the plastics treaty negotiation collapsing. We saw others reporting this as a big failure. And of course, in a sort of technical sense, it was a failure because they failed to conclude in time, but the process hasn't failed yet. I mean, it's way too early to conclude that this process has failed, in my opinion, because they are going to meet again, and the ambition, from what I understand, is still very clearly to conclude this treaty at the resumed session in Geneva.
Right. And I think we also have to consider that the timeline they agreed on in March 2022, when they decided to pursue such a treaty, was super ambitious compared to other multilateral negotiations, right?
It was an ambitious timeline, of course, considering the complexity of the issue. And to be honest with you, I think if my intel is correct, the reason why they chose that deadline, end of 2024, I think it was actually the Americans, the United States, that pushed for this because they wanted to conclude this before their presidential elections, because they knew maybe there will be someone else being the president in 2025. So they were really keen to conclude this. That's what I'm hearing, at least. So it was a little bit of a random deadline, right? I mean, 2 years, we're trying to do it as fast as we can, but there was no sort of strict logic to why exactly end of 2024 would be the deadline for this process, of course. And basically, it wasn't enough time. And I think that became quite clear while we were in Busan. I mean, it's a political challenge, it's an intellectual challenge. And I think there was a realization that, well, we basically just need more time to figure this out.
Right, right. It was an ambitious timeline for such a complex issue. Plastic pollution having so many sources of pollution and so many pathways to tackle it. However, it seemed to me that within this timeline, we were very much lagging behind, you know? We were not really getting to the actual substance of what are we going to do about plastic pollution. So you've had, I think, 4 months now to reflect on the fifth session, or the first part of the fifth session. You've had years to reflect on the entire negotiation process. If you look back, what do you think were the most important obstacles for reaching agreement?
Good question. And I think maybe in my mind there are 2 or 3 main reasons why we didn't conclude in time, and why we're still in the process of negotiating this treaty. And the first is basically too much ambiguity in the negotiation mandate that was adopted to start these negotiations back in March 2022, right? Then the second thing is related to something that we have talked a lot about before, which was unclarity regarding how decisions are to be made, right? That has also made it very, very hard to move things forward, because then when you hit a roadblock, and when some countries that may be, maybe involved in these negotiations primarily to cause problems, then it's very difficult to actually move forward and overcome those roadblocks. So that procedural unclarity, or as well ambiguity, I think had a lot to do with why we weren't able to conclude in time.
Those were 2, the ambiguity and the lack of rules in decision making. Is there another one?
Yeah, I can also say that I think there are some states involved in these negotiations that, I mean, it's increasingly clear to me that they don't really want a treaty. They don't want more regulation of plastics and plastic pollution. They're not particularly concerned about plastic pollution. What they are concerned about is to protect their own plastic production. And they have been given so much space to run their spoiler tactics, right? And we saw that again in Busan, like endless questions, just delaying tactics, interventions to derail and delay and distract the process from what it's supposed to be doing.
I just continue to struggle with the notion that this paper before us, your paper, Mr. Chair, constitutes progress.
Saudi Arabia is one very clear example of a spoiler country that is negotiating in bad faith, meaning that they actually don't want an agreement. They have been given way too much space to run their spoiler tactics in this process, and that's also, I think, a big part of the reason why we are where we are now, without an agreement yet.
Right. And I remember sitting in the hall and listening to the delegate from Saudi Arabia and thinking he was just taking up as much time of this precious conference as he could.
Yeah, I mean, I commented on that intervention. It was like, I think, almost 15 minutes where he took the floor in the plenary and just unmuted his mic and just started ad-libbing, like speaking.
I'll refrain from any statements, and I'll try to speak plainly, Mr. Chair.
It reminded me very much of sometimes when I hear Donald Trump, the now US president, speaking, he just like goes on and like goes in a direction. There's no rhyme or reason or any logic to the statement.
But I suppose every party or member will have issues here and there. That's the nature of the process, and of course we accept it.
It's just basically to be there and talk and try to be relevant. Donald Trump himself, he calls this his big weave in a sense, and it was what we saw from Saudi Arabia in Busan as well. It was just this extremely long intervention, just as I see it, to assert themselves and cause problems and steal time. And just to question everything, any constructive suggestion that is coming from any other country, any other group, or coming from the chair, just to question it, undermine it. And we've seen this before, right? I mean, this is a classic. It's a type of filibustering tactic where you just take the floor and unmute your microphone just to steal time and get people frustrated. So yes, that was that has been a problem. And of course, it's going to be interesting to see, looking ahead to the resumed session in Geneva, how the progressive majority of countries, the majority that are actually involved in these negotiations to produce an agreement, that are keen to solve the problem, how they will deal with this.
So this one example that we just mentioned is one example for a tactic that the countries use to delay or even derail the process. And the high ambition countries, which now consist of many, many countries, I'm not sure what the number is right now. I think they were at 66 before the last INC, maybe they're more now. But they know that very well, that there are these actors in the room that are not negotiating in good faith, basically. To your knowledge, what has been happening since the INC among the people who want to bring this treaty forward to tackle these tactics?
What it seems clear to me, at least, the context that I'm speaking to, is this realization, and particularly amongst ambitious countries, that something needs to change. We can't continue. When we meet in Geneva in August, we can't just continue the same way that we have done things so far in this process. Something needs to change. And I think we do see, we've seen initiatives being taken by states and group of states in that respect. So sort of intersessionally now, since Busan, there is a lot of activity taking place. So states talking with each other bilaterally, they're meeting in small groups, and they're trying to figure out if it's possible to actually come maybe to the meeting in Geneva with a clearer sense of what this treaty should actually do. And we call these sort of state-led initiatives, and we see them. We don't have a full overview of them, but some of them have been reported in the media, and in particular an initiative taken by Norway, and they organized some meetings in Oslo in March last month, where they invited a group of countries to a discussion about some of the key elements of this treaty. And I think this should suggest to me that there are countries and groups of countries actually stepping up and showing some leadership and realizing that, well, if we are going to conclude this treaty, it's on us. We need to do this, and there is no need for us to wait until the meeting in Geneva starts in August to continue the negotiations. If we're going to have any hope of concluding this, we need to work in between. And there's nothing stopping them from doing that. There's nothing stopping one country from talking to another, or one country from talking to a group, or everybody meeting and talking. They can do that. There's nothing stopping them. So we're seeing these developments. And I personally find that very encouraging, because that's the kind of state-led leadership that this process has been lacking a little bit, but that it desperately needs. Will it succeed? We don't know. I was not invited to the meetings, but that's going to be one of the things that I'm looking to in the coming months.
As an observer, what do you think are the most important steps that these countries that are trying to lead the way to an actual ambitious treaty what are the steps they should take to resolve the issues that we've been discussing?
So there's quite a lot of steps that they will have to take. They have a big job ahead of them, I think is very clear. But what I think most importantly, and I'm happy to see that already, that they should not stop negotiating. They should keep negotiating. They should try to find solutions and come to some kind of agreement with each other. I think that's sort of the first thing that they need to do. And I think, in my opinion, they should aim to come to INC 5.2 in Geneva with some clear text proposals, some new text that they have done outreach on, that they have spoken to other members about, and that they know therefore enjoys broad support in the committee, and submit that to the committee as like, okay, we left Busan with this text, and that was a changed text. In the meantime, we have done discussions on these and these and these issues, and here is how far we've come. That is, I think, extremely important that countries do that. And in particular on some of those contentious issues, and we're talking about article numbers here, but like Article 3 on products and chemicals, I think is extremely important to actually do work now, and I'm pleased to see that that's happening. On Article 6 on supply or production, also clearly work needs to be done. On financing, one of the sort of knotty, difficult issues, work needs to be done intersessionally. You can't leave that to Geneva. And then finally, I think on decision making as well, under the Conference of Parties, which I personally see as a very critical issue for the sort of viability of this regime. So these are some of the areas, the articles where work really needs to happen, and where countries need to try to come up with clear solution through clear text, and then mobilize the broadest possible support in the committee around those solutions. Then the second thing is that they need to have a strategy, develop a strategy for how to adopt this treaty in the absence of full consensus. I think it's very clear that if states think that the only way to conclude this treaty is if everybody agrees or nobody disagrees by full consensus, then we're not going to have a treaty. We're not going to have a treaty in Geneva. We're not going to have a treaty ever. That's been made so clear. And therefore, they need to think about, okay, then what do we do? Are there other ways of doing it? They really need a strategy for how to adopt this treaty, and they can't go into 5.2 expecting or assuming that this treaty will be adopted by consensus. If they do that, it's pretty clear to me that then they will fail. They can do as much good substantive work as possible. They can, do a lot of mobilization, but if they're not prepared to actually move ahead and adopt this treaty, conclude this treaty, even if some countries say no, they are not going to succeed.
So there are a couple of ways that countries can move forward to save this process. And I'm glad you're still optimistic, Magnus. Thanks so much for sharing your insights. And I'll see you in Geneva, right?
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you here, and a pleasure as always. Thank you so much, Anya.
As you can see, we are going back and forth between pessimism and optimism here. I guess the likeliest outcome is something in between. Not the super ambitious treaty the United Nations mandate had called for 3 years ago, but hopefully something we can work with. Or not. To learn more, I checked in with Chris Dixon from the Environmental Investigation Agency, EIA. The last time we met was, I guess, you were running around at the conference, and you were also, I think, sitting in a restaurant, I remember, and trying to get a break and eat as fast as you can because you had so much to do. So how did you come out of the INC?
Yeah, it's interesting that you said I was having a meal. I remember seeing you in the restaurant across the road from the conference room, because I think INC 5 was actually the INC that I had the most sit-down meals because of the situation with observers being locked out of the meeting rooms. So previously, I found myself running around like I don't know if you know the British expression, like a headless chicken, but a lot of just running around trying to be in many different places at once. But during this meeting, they closed the doors, and so many people from civil society, from the observer groups, couldn't access the rooms anymore. So I spent a couple of days actually having some time to eat, which I suppose was nice. It's always good to have time to eat, but it certainly, I think, put me into a bit of a strange mood for the meeting. Hearing the concerns of some of my colleagues in civil society and rights holder groups about access, about transparency of the process, knowing what's happening behind closed doors. A lot of that was the mood that sort of took us into the final sessions of INC5, feeling a little bit deflated about where things were heading. And I think if you'd asked me the question on the final night, how I felt about the process, I think I would have given you a different answer to the one I'm giving you now. And so first, I guess the answer that I would have given at the time was that I was really depressed. It felt like a failure. There'd been so much momentum towards reaching an agreement. It felt like it was somehow within reach in the lead up to the meeting. Call me an optimist, but that's how I felt. And then it was quite clear from, at least Sunday morning that it wasn't going to end positively. And so it felt like going through the motions towards the end, to a kind of foregone conclusion. So when I was speaking to media, immediately I was sort of, this feels like the talks have been held hostage. It feels like, what can we do in multilateralism if we're faced with these obstructionist tactics? And that was very much my vibe. But having had time to reflect on the outcomes of INC5 and where we are now, I actually think my response is a lot more positive, and I'm less happy, I suppose, with the sort of, I guess, the media narrative which came out around the outcome of Busan, because if I look at it on a more, kind of narrative level, some of the things that I'd been working on throughout the week around, for example, plastic production, we saw over 100 countries gather around text proposals on plastic production, including things like an ambitious plastic reduction target. And if I was to zoom out on that, I would say that the idea of a plastic reduction target a few years ago was a completely fantastical idea, right? It didn't seem like something that was even in the realms of possibility. And then suddenly you have at INC5 over 100 countries gathering around this concept, and putting their names to the idea of plastic production reduction. So that's really powerful. And there were also, we helped with organizing some of these press conferences where you had not just the kind of typical ambitious countries like the Pacific Islands and Panama and Rwanda, but we also had the EU, France, really gathering behind this kind of rallying call for an ambitious treaty. And of course, there was this moment in the final plenary where Rwanda gave this Stand Up for Ambition talk, where, pretty much the whole plenary was standing up and clapping.
I invite everyone who supports this statement to stand up for ambition.
And the elements that were in that speech were around not just plastic production reduction, but also the banning of products and chemicals, on an ambitious financial mechanism. So really, this was the first time that we actually saw countries en masse gathering around these ideas, and showing kind of solidarity, not just the kind of usual suspects, but also big players that we really need around the kind of final deal, like the EU, kind of finally, I guess, putting their money where their mouth is, although no money, not yet, but the expression. And so actually, there's a lot there to work with going into 5.2. There is, I hate this expression, but the coalition of the willing, but like whatever you want to call it, the 100+ countries, these countries, if they do this right, they can galvanize now a very ambitious outcome, and we can land something at 5.2. And the energy is there, the ideas are there. A lot of the hard work is done. It's now about how we navigate this intersessional period and the final meeting. So I feel a lot more optimistic with the benefit of time, maybe in a good night's sleep and a couple of decent meals. But I think that it's been important to have that extra time to reflect on what is a good outcome versus what is a bad outcome.
How are you, as part of civil society, now preparing for the next conference? Like, Can you share any of the strategies you, as part of the larger civil society movement, are looking into and trying to develop to contribute to a successful outcome?
I think civil society in general have been working, doggedly since INC5 to try and, I guess, contribute to the discussions and sort of try and shape a positive outcome. And I would say the ways in which people do that is myriad. So there's been, on the kind of transparency and participation issue in particular, some of the groups that represent large constituencies, so organizations in civil society that maybe represent members across the global south, for example, have been doing a lot of work to write to INC focal points to reiterate the importance of transparency and participation. And I think from EIA's perspective around the participation issue, we totally recognize that in negotiations, some things happen behind closed doors. Of course they do. Sometimes the absence of observers is the thing that can allow countries to show a little bit more flexibility in their position, both for better or worse, and try and land some of these things. So it's quite common practice that some meetings are closed. I think the issue was that the decisions taken at INC5 to close the meeting rooms were offered without explanation. They didn't follow a due process. And so if things are to be closed, there should be a due process related to transparency and participation and decision making. So it's clear why those decisions have been taken. One of the roles that civil society has in these negotiations, which is really, really important, is offering advice to particularly low capacity government delegations. So often you'll see members of civil society either supporting a country delegation directly by being on that country's delegation, or by sitting near them, offering them briefings, preparing, helping them with content, talking points, real-time coverage of what's happening in another meeting room. Because if that delegation only has two focal points within it, they're often not able to be everywhere. So we play a quite critical role in helping those low-capacity governments cover all the different things that are happening, summarizing, discussions that have happened in one place that they weren't part of. And that's actually one of the concerns that we had with being locked out, is that we're then unable to support those low-capacity governments, and it really disadvantages them in the negotiations. When you look at delegations of the EU, of the US, for example, who have dozens of people, they can be absolutely everywhere. So it gives them a real upper hand when you compare it to, say, an African country or a small island developing state. Many of my colleagues in civil society are working to prepare arguments, briefs, giving presentations to governments, basically helping equip them on all of the content to prepare them for the negotiations. And so, yeah, I think those are probably the most important things that civil society are doing right now, thinking through some of the strategies around how to land this deal without compromising on some of the most ambitious elements of the treaty, and sort of supporting governments to have those conversations and have the best information, the most readily available, accurate, scientifically robust, evidence-based decisions.
You mentioned, how to get more people involved, how to brief these smaller delegations and make sure that they have a good overview. But plastic pollution is such a huge issue. So are you focusing on specific issues for the next round of negotiations?
Yeah, definitely. And I think what we don't want to see now heading into 5.2 is that there's no interest, because, it's just another treaty process that is going to go on and on and on, like the BBNJ, the Global Ocean Treaty, which went on for decades. And so a lot of the organizations within civil society are thinking about how can we galvanize the public attention that is necessary to put pressure on governments to actually finalize this deal. Like, governments around the world need to feel that there is a level of pressure and attention on them, and that this issue is important to people, it's important to humanity, and they need to kind of come and close this deal. So yes, there's a lot of effort going on around national and international campaigns. How can we raise the profile of this topic? How can we make links to other issues? So I've been part of a lot of conversations recently, for example, around, the health aspect. So that it's not just about climate, it's not just about biodiversity loss, it's also a commentary on the health crisis. It's also an issue around economics, geopolitics. And so there's a lot of narrative work that's happening. And then whether it's about specific topics or not, I think the question is like, there are some areas of the treaty text where progress was really made at INC 5, actually, but where we don't have, we've been calling them at EIA the kind of binary topics, like plastic production. So we know that over 100 countries wanted this text proposal on plastic production, but there are another group of countries that don't want plastic production at all. It's the same for the products and chemicals of concern. It's not about, can you make a text that will meet the agreement of those countries? It's like some countries just don't want it in at all, and it's a hard red line. So a lot of the campaigning has focused on those topics, the binary topics, like can we create enough momentum that it's no longer tenable to have the position that is a hard red line, that we can hold the negotiations hostage just because we don't want production. Because actually, when you look at the fact that over 100 countries want production in, that means it needs to be on the table, and nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So I would say that a lot of the attention has been on those binary topics, and also around trying to move issues like plastic product design, for example. One of the reasons we think that's a really important provision is because a product design provision designed well has a lot of potential to help with eliminating chemicals of concern from the design of plastic products. It has the potential to create obligations related to reducing the amount of plastic that's even used in products and making certain types of plastics unacceptable to use at the global level. So it's a very important provision, but there just hasn't been enough attention on it. So another thing that we've been trying to do is to sort of raise the profile of product design as something that's quite important also for facilitating the kind of alternative systems for the future that we see as being a really important part of the puzzle. A product design provision can kind of open the door for reuse, for refill, for repair, and creating those kind of harmonization that would be necessary to scale those kind of alternative systems. So that's, I think, where a lot of the energy is, and relatedly, how those things can relate to the finance negotiations. And that's a big piece that's really complicated because, the countries that are going to pay into a fund for a new plastics treaty are very unlikely to commit to funding a waste management treaty. Why should donor countries pay for waste management, pay for things that really are the responsibility of the industry? What some of those donor countries would like to see is a treaty with meaningful provisions. So that means commitments on things like reduction, on banning certain products that have a high risk of leakage into the environment. And making a firm commitment about putting money into a fund kind of relates to having an agreement on those binary topics. So I think that's a very long answer to your question, so I apologize, but it relates to where the energy is for putting public attention on these topics intersessionally.
And one way to raise public attention for a meeting like the next one, you might compare it to like music. If there's a band of older musicians, let's say the Rolling Stones, and they want to do another tour, it will always be the last tour, right? This is the last one. And then that gets the attention and people are like, I got to go, I got to report. But then maybe a couple of years later, it turns out it's not the last one. They're doing another one. So what's your expectation? Is this going to be the last round of negotiations? Are we going to come out of this with an agreement?
Well, I think your Rolling Stones analogy is possibly the best one I've heard thus far, so I'm going to steal that and use it again. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we tried to do at INC 5, right? Is that every single journalist you speak to, everybody you speak to, you tell this is the last round, even if in the back of your head you're like, I actually just don't know if we're there. This message discipline is really important. And so it would be the same heading into INC 5.2. I think it's really, really important to create the right conditions for reaching agreement at 5.2 that we all, the media, the delegates, civil society, scientists, we all believe that this is our last chance to get it right. So to do it properly and get it done. And I think something that's a little bit different in terms of the conditions that we didn't have at INC 5 is the looming deadline of UNEP 7. So if you recall, the Plastics Treaty mandate for the negotiations came out of UNEP 5.2. So it was a UN Environment Assembly decision to negotiate the treaty, and that set the parameters, it set the 2024 deadline. If we haven't finished at 5.2, the next UNEP meeting is coming up in December of this year. And so UNEA represents this opportunity to kind of reshuffle the deck, both positively and negatively. So we could see, for example, countries putting in a new resolution at UNEA 7, threatening to kind of, like, I guess, revisit the mandate or basically kind of like change the terms of the conversation because we haven't reached an agreement. And while I think you could also use UNEA for good, ambitious countries could also put in a powerful resolution and kind of even strengthen the mandate for the negotiations. It's a bit of an unknown entity. And so I think that deadline creates an additional pressure on 5.2 that we didn't have in Busan. So yeah, let's hope it's a Rolling Stones final concert moment, sellout tour, everyone's there. And we do know already that ministers are coming. So these are like, the VIPs are coming, and really, no minister wants to take time out of their summer holidays if they're European in August, come to Geneva and it be a flop. So there's additional conditions in place now. The ministers, the deadline of UNEA, the failure, I guess, if you want to call it that, of Busan, which are all part of the, if you want to throw them in a cooking pot, there's something that could be the ingredients for a different and better outcome. So I'm actually pretty positive that we could get it done. But just the question is, what is it? Is it an ambitious treaty that I'm really happy with? Is it something more like in the middle where it's quite good and we have the elements there for decision making, for strengthening over time, maybe some options to accelerate progress on provisions that couldn't be agreed in Geneva? Or is it we're agreeing to something that's not worth the paper that it's written on? And I think there's those three scenarios, plus I guess a fourth scenario where things completely implode. And I don't know which one we're going to get, but I feel like it's heading more in the direction of reaching an agreement with strong hooks for strengthening over time. So that's kind of what I'm holding out my hope for. And we're just pushing really hard to make sure that those countries that put their name on ambitious proposals don't pre-negotiate with themselves during this intercessional period. So we have this expression we always talk about, like, why are people just negotiating with themselves? So like already spending time like watering down a position before they're forced to defend a position in a negotiating room, because they're afraid of like, oh, well, if we come out with this position, then, we'll alienate another country. And it's like, well, if you haven't tested that before you put it out there, why immediately kind of climb down your position? Because you don't need to climb down on your position until you're sat face to face with a country telling you that there's no way to reach an agreement unless you step down. So you always want to come in with the strongest possible position. So I hope that these countries are holding firm on some of their commitments that they made in Busan, because for me, that's also a key part of reaching a good outcome in Geneva.
Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing all these insights with us. And I guess we'll meet again in Geneva if I make it there.
Yeah, I hope so. It's not too far from Berlin.
Much closer than Busan. Everything depends on the diplomatic finesse of the negotiators now. How can the majority of ambitious countries counter the tactics of the small minority of states that are sabotaging the process? As we heard, some of the most important work actually happens when the world isn't watching, in between the actual meetings that we hear from in the media. The month between the meeting in Busan and the one in Geneva are especially important. To get additional insights, I called Andrés Del Castillo from CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law. In Busan, I had seen him around, but wasn't really able to speak with him. At the last round of negotiations, I saw you walking around with that baseball cap that had 3 letters written on it, C, A, and P, so basically just cap. So tell us more. What's that cap and what are these caps all about? And what happened to it in South Korea?
Yeah, thank you. That was a simple message that was cap for caps, right? That is one of the main ambition measures that need to be taken in order to tackle plastic pollution, right? Cap plastic production. And it was a simple message, but maybe you also saw some delegates using and wearing the cap during the meeting, and even during the you have, for instance, the Mexican delegate using the cap during the press conference, right? So at the end, some of those caps are used by also ambitious delegates to show what they stand for. And at some point, we had a joke also that the High Ambition Coalition was now replaced the H from the Hat Ambition Coalition, right?
The hat, the ones wearing the hat.
Yes, you saw the Panama delegates also wearing a hat, so that was kind of the humor side of, and also the spirit of the end of the meeting in Busan. So,
those were all your caps that the delegates were wearing?
Yes. We don't bring too many of those, but only few for delegates, around 20 for those delegates that deserve, because they have been proved being very ambitious on that. But we didn't have enough cap for the 100 countries that kind of back a strong provision on plastic production.
Yeah, and I think there was actually even more demand among the observers and people like me. I would also classify myself as Team CAP as well, because I was part of the team of people who wrote that letter to the journal Science called "A Global Plastics Treaty Must Cap Production." Because if production continues to grow, we can try all the solutions we want. They just won't be enough. We won't keep up with the sheer growth of material with just better waste management, recycling, with cleanup or other approaches. Would you say that there is more or less momentum to get an ambitious and binding treaty this year?
There is more attention than before to what is going to happen in the meeting, because the international environmental agenda this year is crazy. And you have many meetings going on, the first semester of 2025, but also you're going to have more meetings to come for the second semester that all will be linked to the discussions that will be necessary to get where we want to get and land into a plastic treaty in Geneva during the European summer.
Which are these? What meetings are going to happen? We are now at the end of April recording this. So what should we look out for?
Yeah, there's a list of meetings. For instance, the Conference of the Parties of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions that are mainly the multilateral conventions on chemicals and the control of chemicals and hazardous waste. And also there will be this big UN Conference of the Ocean happening in June in Nice, then followed by a conference for finance for development happening in Sevilla this year. You're going to have a meeting of the head of delegations of the plastic treaty happening in Nairobi at the beginning of July. And in beginning of August already the plastic treaty negotiations, and after that you will have the UN General Assembly and the Climate Week happening in New York, followed by the October meeting of the World Conservation Congress in Abu Dhabi, and then the COP30 on climate in Brazil with a huge emphasis of indigenous peoples, and finalizing with the UNEP that usually happens at the beginning of the year, right? But this time it will happen at the end of the year, so December 2025. So you have a packed agenda on meetings, just, main meetings happening without counting all the regional things.
I wonder, as a strategist, as campaigners, how do you weave the plastic topic through all of those things happening? I mean, how do you keep things together when everything is happening at once?
On international negotiations, there is a tendency usually on how countries behave, and sometimes we are talking about the same negotiators that are in one place and jump to the other to negotiate. So some of the negotiators on environmental matters, they work on climate, but they also cover biodiversity and sometimes even the plastic aspect. So what is interesting to look at here is one single message, is how multilateralism can deliver. You have all the tools here in Geneva that includes all the expertise from, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, all the human rights bodies here, and the International Labour Organization based also here in Geneva, the UNEP chemical unit also here in Geneva, and more than 180 permanent missions with high profiles is the place. You have the recipe for success.
That would be great. Give us an outlook from your perspective. What are the most likely scenarios for the Geneva meeting in August?
Yeah, when you look at the Geneva meeting, I think there is mobilization and interest in getting something done. The question is on the details, what? And also how the treaty needs to be legally sound to be a treaty and to be approved. And for that, for a treaty to be legally sound, you need the legal drafting group that is established there but was never used during Busan, and work on a text that makes sense from the legal perspective, right? That the text is translated to the 6 official language. So, and that kind of things take time. That means that for the plastic treaty, at least we're going to have 3 years between the diplomatic conference and the entry in force of that agreement, and what it means for that, and what will be the plan.
Just for the people among us who are not familiar with these multilateral negotiations and the jargon connected to it. So we've already introduced the INCs, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meetings that have been happening now 5 times. So just give us like a brief outlook, like beyond, let's say at the Geneva meeting, at this INC, we get an actual agreement. What will happen next when they're done? What are the steps that such a treaty process then takes? And when does it take effect? When does the treaty actually take effect?
Thank you. So if we have an agreement and even that passed the filter of the legal drafting group, that is a group composed by legal experts nominated by countries that say, okay, this text, sounds good from the legal perspective, then usually the executive director of UNEP need to call for a conference of plenipotentiaries, right? Or diplomatic conference, which is a meeting where the countries will adopt the treaty. And then after that, you have a ceremony of signature of the treaty. But the diplomatic conference also, apart from the ministers going there or heads of the states and saying, yes, I engage my country, they will need to pass through national parliaments, right? For the treaty to be internalized, right, and entering force. And then the treaty itself needs to have a threshold of how many countries do we need for the treaty to enter in force, right? And so far, I guess it's 50 or 60 countries, the number of countries. And this is not an easy task to get that number of countries, because countries need to consult internally if they want to engage or not, what it means for them. So there are a lot of internal consultation that needs to happen for that. Even if the country accepted and adopted the treaty, that doesn't mean that the ratification process is automatic. It depends the legal system. But besides that, you will need to have some specific decisions of, okay, what is going to happen between the moment that, ministers take the picture, maybe signing the treaty, and the first day of the entering force of the convention. So usually you have, in the case of the Minamata Convention, you had 2 additional INCs meetings, right, taking place, that were kind of advancing the work for the first conference of the party, that is the kind of the General Assembly for that specific treaty, with all the parties will be present and decide what are the steps that need to be taken to implement the convention. But you don't go to a conference of the party without preparatory work. And this is the kind of work that need to be done. For instance, take an example of, an article on production. Okay, what will be the measure for to say, okay, we can't produce more than this. This is the target, to reduce production by 40%, for instance, by 2040. This kind of exercise needs to happen before that governing body meeting happen, the conference of the parties. So this is what I mean for the plan. Whatever is is the outcome of the Geneva meeting. There's still some work to be done. But this is in the case that we adopt a treaty. But sometimes you adopt a treaty, but not with the elements that need to be included. And the question is, what happens if there is one part of that backbone that is missing, right? Sometimes countries, they exclude one topic, they compromise on something, but they say, let's keep negotiating about that because we're not ready for that. And that is a probability too that we need to be aware of.
Right. Andrés, thank you so much for all your insights. As a last question, we were talking about humor in the beginning. With all the attacks on science and all the attacks on environmental protection, how do you keep up your good humor and your good faith?
There are good signs of in the world of things happening that are good. So I guess taking that side, not being naive, but making sure also that you integrate pop culture into dry discussions is also a way to do it. And campaigners or legal experts, we also need to show and to demonstrate that it's possible. There are examples, and there are many examples that shows that when you have an idea, even if you have a core group, a few people that believe in that idea, that is hope, and can be the beginning, and that can change many things in the world.
Thank you so much, Andrés. So let's keep up the good spirits. We still have a chance to get a treaty that will tackle plastic pollution on a global level, or one that can grow stronger over time. This has happened in other cases as well, and treaty making always takes time. Even if the whole process failed, there would be a large alliance of countries that are serious about tackling the issue. Wait until the end of the episode to get a taste of that. But first, the credits. Thanks to Dorian Roy for the theme and Blue Dot Sessions for additional music, Maren von Stockhausen for the cover art, and my 3 guests for taking the time to speak with us. And a call for support. To travel and stay in Geneva for 2 weeks will be super expensive. This is an independent podcast which I produce in my free time without funding. So please help me get there if you can. Every contribution helps, no matter how small. Go to the show notes or to plastisphere.earth/support and find my PayPal there. You'll help me continue my work. And now, a last snippet from the final night in South Korea. Enjoy and see you soon.
Y ahora le doy la palabra a...
And I'll give the floor to Mexico, followed by Mali. Mexico has the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished delegates, colleagues. Mexico has the honor to take the floor on behalf of a very diverse group of countries from all over the world. So bear with me. Given the importance of the message we are conveying, I want to make them justice and give all of our voices visibility. So on behalf of Angola, Antigua and Barbuda, Australia, Bangladesh, Barbados, Bhutan, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Comoros, Cook Islands, Costa Rica, Côte d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Eswatini, Ethiopia, European Union, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Fiji, Gabon, Georgia, Ghana, Grenada, Guatemala, Guinea, Honduras, Iceland, Israel, Kenya, Kiribati, Lesotho, Madagascar, Malawi, Maldives, Mali, Marshall Island, Micronesia, Mexico, Monaco, Namibia, Nauru, New Zealand, Nigeria, Niue, Norway, Panama, Papua New Guinea, Peru, Philippines, Republic of Congo, Republic of Moldova, Rwanda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Senegal, Serbia, Seychelles, Switzerland, Togo, Tonga, Trinidad and Tobago, UK, Ukraine, Uruguay, Vanuatu, and Zimbabwe. Colleagues, we carry the weight of expectations of our citizens who are counting on us to protect them and the environment from the plastic pollution crisis. We must do everything within our power to meet this expectation. This is our shared determination to ensure this instrument will target and eliminate the most urgent risk of plastic pollution at the global level. The article on plastic products and chemicals in the instrument text must contain a clear, legally binding obligation to phase out the most harmful plastic products and chemicals of concern in plastics. Without such an obligation, the instrument will fail to deliver the predictable regulatory framework urgently needed by states, businesses, civil society, and the environment. A treaty without clear, legally binding rules is not acceptable. It would reflect neither the ambition nor the specific text proposals supported by the vast majority of states in these negotiations. It would be a treaty in name only. A legally binding obligation to phase out the most harmful plastic products and chemicals of concern in plastics is a cornerstone for an effective treaty. It is what we must do to protect human health and the environment from plastic pollution, as promised by UNEP Resolution 514. We all arrived in Busan with the hope of achieving a strong treaty to combat plastic pollution. But hope alone is not enough. We must act decisively. We are 94 states supporting this statement, taking a stand to make it a reality. Chair, we insist. 95 countries have spoken and hope more can join. As ambitious, willing states, we stand ready to move forward and conclude this obligation. Let us seize the moment to deliver the decisive action that our people and planet urgently need. Thank you.